I am delighted this afternoon to be joined by Sofia Crisp, Housing Consultants Group Executive Director. This organization provides financial wellness education and partners with local governments to offer down payment assistance. Michelle Kennedy is the City of Greensboro's Neighborhood Development Director. She's also the former Executive Director of Interactive Resource Center, which worked with homeless people. And Stephen Sills is Center for Housing and Community Studies Director. He's a UNC Greensboro researcher on affordable and healthy homes in North Carolina and beyond. Stephen, I want to start with you, and I want to pick up on our video and this issue of evictions. It's one thing to hear that Greensboro has high eviction rates. It's another thing to unpack the data point that Greensboro has the 7th highest eviction rate in the nation. What is it about the context of this housing market that makes that so?
It's the lack of affordability in our area combined with low wages. When we look at the earnings potential of the average worker here and the cost of living to live here, there's a gap. So many people fall through that gap, one paycheck, one medical bill, one car breakdown away from being evicted, unable to pay their rent or their mortgage even. So that lack of affordability placed us number 7 in the country and number 1 in North Carolina for our eviction rate per renter household, according to the Princeton Eviction Lab. Our numbers haven't gotten better since that study in 2016. We saw that in the year prior to COVID, there were still 5,000 writs of possession issued in the county. That's 5,000 sheriff's lockouts for eviction in this area.
Michelle, pick up there for me if you might. What Stephen says makes clear that there is demand for affordable housing. What accounts for the market failure such that we are not producing the housing that so many people need?
I think you can look back to long-standing things, issues of institutional racism, structural inequity that have kept those developments from happening in the areas that needed them most. But I think post-2008, a lot of developers who had really invested in affordable housing developments couldn't find a financial reason to continue to do so, and so that part of the market dried up, and it made it more difficult to have the housing stock that we need for folks at those income levels.
So you're saying the numbers just don't add up, that if you were a producer of affordable housing without subsidies, it would be difficult to have a return on the investment?
I think it certainly is, and I think that that's where counties and cities come into play to look at ways to incentivize development to help address the issue of affordability for the folks that need it most.
Stephen, I want to just go back to you for a second here, because when we talk about evictions, there are 2 sets of interests at play, both important interests. There's the interest in the tenant in having safe, affordable housing, and the interest in the property owner in, to the conversation I'm having with Michelle, recouping a return on the investment. So how do you recalibrate in Greensboro so that both of those interests can be met?
I think both of those interests aren't competing interests. It's expensive to turn a property. We had a landlord advisory group in 2018 tell us that it's about $4,000 on average per unit in lost rent, in repairs, in advertising, in the month or 2 that it takes to get a unit re-rented. It's in their best interest to have a tenant stay. Tenants don't want to move. They lose property in the move. They lose their deposit. They lose their domestic appliances and furnishings. We had one child who was interviewed as part of a family who said, "Mommy, where did my bedroom go?" When they had to move due to eviction. The human impact is much more intangible than the cost itself, but certainly felt as well in behavioral health issues, in mental health, in physical health that comes out from the impact of evictions. I think we can square that, though. There are resources to currently assist those who are facing eviction to pay back past due rent through emergency rental assistance programs and others. But moving forward, we, as Michelle said, need to find ways to subsidize affordable housing opportunities and make it profitable both for the landlord to rent those units, as well as the tenant to remain in them.
Sofia, jump in here for me, please. We're here in Greensboro not just because of the significant need, but because of the responses that this community has taken to try to meet that need. In 2016, your voters approved a $25 million bond, is that right?
Yes.
To increase efforts to build and repair affordable housing. And the Greensboro 10-year housing plan resulted from that work. How do you think the implementation is going?
In the area of home ownership, it's going great. We took a disaster that happened in 2018 and turned it into a huge success story. The tornado that hit in 2018 significantly affected people living in some of the poorest zip codes in the city. And a year later, my organization launched something called #100Homes, hoping that 100 of the 600 people that were affected by the tornado would want to be on the path to home ownership. And that's exactly what 317 of them did in 2019.
Wait, your goal was 100 and you ended up with 317?
317
Wow.
in 2019 homeowners, significant percentage, maybe 60 to 70% in that same zip code, which was
Hashtag
great.
you rock.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. And then last year, despite the pandemic, the numbers were even higher. They were 347. So there's no lack of people that want to be homeowners. There's a lack of homes for them to purchase. And the city has done a great effort in providing that gap financing needed to help developers grow, even new developers. Several minority developers even start their careers in developing homes, but there's not enough. So there's no lack of effort. There's just not enough people who find it and are passionate about home ownership in areas of need and are willing to make a little bit less money on a home, but start people on the path to generational wealth by owning a home.
Michelle, what's next? What are other things that have happened since the bond, since 2018? And how do you get to scale?
I think the 2016 housing bonds gave us an excellent opportunity to make investments at levels we'd never been able to make before. And so that really was a stepping off ground for a lot of innovative programs that we're looking at today. Everything from receivership, how to get properties that could become those units that folks could reinvest in back online as quickly as possible, looking at land banking and how that makes significant changes in these
And
communities.
would you say what land banking is for our viewers who may not be aware?
The quick version is holding on to parcels of property to be able to be redeveloped in areas where they're needed.
Thank you.
The other thing is the housing GSO plan and the 10-year plan to end homelessness was really born from and grown from 2016 and into 2018 and was finalized in October 2020. And that's given us some clear road marks for where we need to go, the pathways we need to get there. And it was a large-scale community-involved process. And I think only community-involved processes ever really work. And that's what you're seeing in Greensboro, is what happens when community comes together to make the decisions for themselves instead of people determining for those communities.
Tell me a little bit about the process of people coming together. Who are you involving? How are you involving them? And what is the result? And any one of you could answer that question for me.
So I think that everybody sitting up here with you today have been working with each other for years in different lenses and at same tables. And it involves elected officials, it involves people in local and county government, it involves neighborhood associations. It really involves the citizenry of Greensboro to be at the table. If we don't center the lives of those with lived experience, we're really missing the point. We're currently looking at trying to establish our first permanent supportive housing development for high acuity folks who are transitioning out of homelessness. There are huge gains in that because when you raise the floor, you raise the ceiling.
I want to piggyback on what she said about making sure that you're making decisions for people with them.
Yes.
It's town halls, it's coming together, multiple sessions. It's a little bit of work, but it's necessary to work to make sure that we're not sitting here because we do this work assuming what people want. You don't know what people want until you ask them.
What have you heard in one of these community engagement activities that made you go, man, I would not have thought of that? Any one of you?
I would say one of the things that really resonates with me is hearing repeatedly from communities that want to see more opportunities for home ownership. And what they see being developed in their neighborhoods are rental opportunities only. And if you are a person like me who has the privilege of being a white person in this country, that may not be something that in my neighborhood I've ever had to experience. We need to listen to that. We need to take that into account.
And speaking of the disparities, when you look at the home ownership rate among people of color versus people that are Caucasian, it is a huge gap. And that's the difference between having something to pass on to your children and your grandchildren. The home that was $60,000 that your grandparents may have bought, if it stays in the family long enough, is of value and creates that generational wealth and creates opportunities. Maybe for college or something, or small business startups. I mean, it makes a huge difference. But if you don't have that, your net worth is significantly lower.
We've seen that home ownership rate decline, in fact, since 2000, partly because of the 2008 to 2012 housing crisis. In African American communities, we see a home ownership rate now of 27%. That's a significant decrease from where we were just a few years ago.
And is that about the housing stock or mortgage availability?
It's about predatory lending that occurred prior to that allowed for people who could have gotten market rate mortgages to get loans that were predatory, adjustable rate mortgages that when something happened in their life, like Stephen was talking about, loss of a paycheck, major illness, was the key factor in them losing their home.
Losing their homes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Go ahead, Stephen, I interrupted you.
The other thing that we hear, though, is that housing is related to so many other things. Housing in schools, housing and access to food, housing and access to health care. And so it's not just a solution that fixes housing and lifetime earnings and intergenerational wealth, but housing and all other aspects of living. We have to think of those as a comprehensive system together, not in isolation from each other. I think that comes out definitely in community meetings where we're hearing, food access for me is an issue because of my neighborhood's lack of resources. How do we fix all of those things at once is the really complicated issue.
Yeah.
I think when you consider at its most base level, housing really is healthcare and is a cornerstone for our community. And if you're someone who's spent your career in this world and you've, for example, ever had the opportunity to see a cockroach pulled from the ear of a child who's living in substandard housing, or watch the asthma prevalence rates of children who are exposed to mold, you understand just how deeply housing impacts every part of that child or that family's life. And he's exactly right. Those are critical pieces. The interconnection between all of these things can't be overstated. And until we see it as a collective system, we're never going to do the things we need to do to address it all.
Well, it strikes me the implication of what you're saying, Michelle, is we're going to pay for it one way or the other. Right. It's going to be in the emergency room when that child has an acute asthma attack if it's not remediating the mold in the home.
We can choose to take a reactive approach and wait for things to go wrong, or we can, as a community and as a system, decide that we're going to be proactive and we're going to build the solutions on the front end. And I think all of us would agree that that's a much better use of our resources and our efforts. And what that does for our city as a whole is huge. And it's much easier for us to make those investments on the front end and set our children up for success, as opposed to having to figure out how to correct these things when they go wrong.
Absolutely. I've got one more question for you all, but I want to let the audience know that after that question, we're going to take audience questions, and the microphone is set up in the aisle here. So just be thinking about your question and be ready to share it when I get through. Has anybody tried to figure out the price tag? What would it take to have an adequate supply of affordable housing in Greensboro?
That's a huge question.
I know, that's why I asked it.
Oh, I think that's where you get into conversations around subsidies, around vouchers, around what kind of supports need to be built in on top of just market rate housing to help determine that. That sounds like a great project for a researcher.
It does.
Sorry, Stephen, I didn't mean to give you more work, but since you're here.
Not at all. I think that return on investment kind of question is key here. But even more key is, what is the cost for not providing more housing? Our issue is both the economic input as well as the expense. It's the wages as well as the cost of living. So if we don't provide good housing, if we have all of these health issues and food access issues, then we're going to lose even further in attracting good business, attracting living wages, and addressing it on the front end. And I think that's going to cost us. When we have a vacant property in a neighborhood, it impacts the city and its revenue, and its tax revenue. It also impacts the values of the homes around it. And there have been some good studies that look at what is one vacant property, what does 10 vacant properties cost a city in terms of lost potential revenue. But that overall cost, we have 45% of renters and 27% of homeowners who are cost burdened, spending more than 30% of their income on housing and housing-related expenses. If we could bring those numbers down, if we could make it so that people could afford the places they live, what kind of new economic impact would that have? I think it would pay off in the long term. The dollar invested and the 5 returned would be worthwhile.
And I think when you look at also since March of this year, through emergency rental assistance, we've invested more than $13.4 million back into our community for folks who've been impacted by the pandemic and otherwise. 2,794 households touched. What happens if those programs aren't there?
Yeah.
How does that feed into all the things Stephen just described?
And those numbers are growing.
Indeed.
They are growing. And there's another factor here we haven't talked about is the price of housing. The price of housing the last year, my background's real estate, is not keeping up with the level of affordability. So we have another issue. You've got people that are ready to buy, and because the values of homes have gone up so significantly, somewhat overinflated, and you wonder how sustainable that is. I don't think it is, but for the time being, there are people sitting in my classes twice a month ready to buy. Some of them are competing for the same properties. And properties are going under contract in 24 hours. Cash buyers, sometimes not from the state and not from the country.
Yeah.
A lot of competition.
That's part of it, is the demand from buyers, and then the reality that construction costs have totally soared, so it makes it that much more expensive to construct new homes.
The value, construction costs, COVID are the trifecta of the problem here.
Yeah.
And out of control and not that easy to fix.
Indeed. And the recognition that Greensboro sits within a nation that struggles with these issues. They're certainly not particular to this area or region. Questions from the audience? What do you want to know about affordable housing in Greensboro? So I'm particularly looking at my friend who said she was going to keep everybody honest.
She had a question.
Councilwoman Hightower.
I'm sorry. Yes, go ahead.
Good evening. Thank you all for being here. My name is Holly Owner. I am a supervising attorney with the Housing Unit for Legal Aid of North Carolina in the Greensboro office. I don't have a question, but I did want to take this opportunity to make a little bit of a pitch for you all to know, for the audience to know, for anybody who might be watching to know. Just last week, we implemented an inaugural project over at the courthouse. It is a partnership between UNCG's Center for Housing Community Studies and Renee Norris, who's here, is our mediator. We have a judge from the court who is in the audience as well.
Judge, we want to see you. Raise your hand. Nice.
And we have legal aid lawyers, we have a representative from the city of Greensboro, and we have a representative from Guilford County. It is now happening only on Tuesdays, and what happens is we're seeing there are approximately 80 cases on the docket, the vast majority of which tenants are being evicted for non-payment of rent for reasons, as you all have talked about. They got behind because of the pandemic, because of losing a job, because of that one little emergency that was the difference between paying one bill or paying rent. They have applied for rental assistance, and the rental assistance just hasn't come through yet. And these people are being evicted in court simultaneously. The caseworkers that work for Housing Consultants Group or work for Greensboro Housing Coalition or work for Salvation Army are diligently processing their applications. And that is a very simple failure that can be easily fixed by bringing everybody together and bringing everybody to the table. And so I want to make a pitch for this program. It's happening in the courthouse on Tuesdays, and it's an opportunity for landlords and tenants to meet with the rental assistance people from the county and city and to understand where their application is so that we can simply get the money paid, get their tenants caught up, and preserve tenancies for these families. It's been wildly successful in the 2 times we've done it so far, last Tuesday and this Tuesday, and it's our hope that we'll be able to massively expand the project so that this is something we can do in the courthouse every day that we have eviction court, because people are being unnecessarily evicted. Once they have the eviction on their record, it only makes it harder for them to rent in the future. It makes it harder for them to apply for a loan if they ever do want to buy a house in the future. And so to the extent that we can spread the word for this program, I want to take the opportunity to do that. So thank you all for having this.
Thank you so much for that. So Stephen, that's the win-win you talked about,
Totally.
right?
I studied for 4 years right to counsel movements across the country, looking at eviction resolution, diversion, mediation programs, and it really is effective. It's effective in Michigan, in New York, in Washington, D.C., and we've seen around this state. Duke University has a program. In Asheville, there's a program. In Charlotte, there's a program. By having representation there in the courtroom for tenants, as well as mediators there for landlords, we can find that win-win, that solution for both parties.
So win-win is what this is all about, and obviously, as I said in the beginning, we're here because you're doing innovative things in Greensboro that we want to share with the rest of the state. So I want to leave you with an opportunity to look forward a bit, peer into your crystal ball to the extent that you remember to clean it recently. What are you hopeful about?
I'm hopeful that the city will continue to partner with developers and make it more attractive for them to want to build. We have some great startups and we have some great existing nonprofits and for-profits. I think the more the city engages with developers, the more we'll be able to get some more single-family housing that's available for home ownership.
Excellent.
I think I'm hopeful that city-county partnerships continue to grow and evolve. They're so critical to expand the resources that are available and to look forward to another housing bond so we can continue to have transformative projects to move us forward as a community.
I think we finally have the alignment between the need that has been there, the nonprofits and governmental agencies that have been trying so hard to work together, and the resources beginning to flow that can address some of the underlying root causes that have created the situation that we're in.
It is clear that it's not coincidental that for each of the 3 of you, what leaves you hopeful is the ability to work together in partnership, in collaboration with others. I want to congratulate you on how far those partnerships and collaborations have brought this community and tell you that we'll be watching you very carefully and wanting to profile the next great leap forward. Please, audience, join me in thanking this panel.